Hello. As we end this course, I want to say a few words about Luke's Olivet Discourse, or the Jesus Apocalypse. In general, looking at the Olivet Discourse as a common feature of each of the synoptics, we see that this prophecy belongs to a long tradition that begins way back in the 8th century BC with Amos and Hosea, the northern prophets, and the Judean prophets, Isaiah and Micah. Their phrase by which they describe Yahweh's inbreaking into history to bring it to an end was the day of Yahweh. This day of the Lord had two aspects to it: judgment on Israel's enemies and salvation for Israel herself. However, Amos famously said, "Woe to those who long for the day of the Lord. It's not a day of light, it's a day of darkness." In other words, Amos is saying, even if you're an Israelite, you better be careful with what you wish for. Now, we must not look at these prophecies in a quantitative way. That means the prophecies had a particular one-time fulfillment in history, but a qualitative way. The day of the Lord has a quality to it, and as such, multiple fulfillments that have a certain shared quality. The prophets foresaw a day of the Lord that would come upon Samaria in 722 BC, which brought down the kingdom of Israel in a decisive and catastrophic way. However, as we see these Day of the Lord prophecies fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem and her temple in 586, we see that indeed this is another fulfillment, a multi-fulfillment, a certain quality that the two share. These events have an end-of-the-world quality in the history of salvation. As we consider these prophecies that had a historic fulfillment, it is not hard to see that there is an even further fulfillment in the coming of Christ and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 67, or 67. These prophecies are the background for Jesus' apocalypse, which were fulfilled in the destruction of the temple. Truly historical, cataclysmic event that changed the world forever. As we have seen in the segment titled The Jesus Apocalypse in week 2, when we were studying Mark, the temple and the cosmos were connected. When Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, it naturally meant the end of the world in the disciples' thinking. Now, Mark was most probably written before the destruction of the temple. Of the three synoptics, Mark is the most futuristic in the way he presents Jesus' discourse. In other words, the end is near. In week 5, in our discussion of Matthew, Dr. Brown taught us that the best way to interpret the Olivet Discourse in Matthew was the preterist view, which means that looking in hindsight, this prophecy was fulfilled in the destruction of the temple in 68 AD. Matthew follows up his discourse with a parables that hint of delay of the final eschatological end, that is, the parable of the foolish virgins and the talents, suggesting we must be vigilant over a long period of time. And this is true especially if Matthew is written after the destruction of the temple. Now, when we get to Luke, probably written after Matthew, and therefore even more likely written after the destruction of the temple, we find he is most obviously preterist in his perspective. In this week's lesson, we see in the page Luke's Jesus Apocalypse, chapter 21, the subtle differences and additions Luke makes in his Olivet Discourse. These additions in Luke bends the whole prophecy toward the fulfillment at the destruction of the temple in 68 AD. So we see a bit of progression from Mark, who's most futuristic in his discourse, to Matthew, who followed Mark closely but immediately follows it up with the parables of delay, to Luke, who is decidedly preteristic. However, when we see these discourses in light of the prophetic tradition in which they stand, it was very natural for the first century church to understand them as having multiple fulfillments. Again, it is not the quality, that is, a specific one-time event, but the quality of the day of the Lord. The destruction of Jerusalem and her temple in 68 AD was catastrophic to the Jewish nation in a cosmic sort of a way. And Jesus' prophecy of her end certainly displays a vivid picture of the final eschatological end of the world, the ultimate fulfillment of the whole prophetic tradition of the day of the Lord. Now we see this when we go to the book of Revelation. The mark and flow of the events, which both Matthew and Luke follow, gives structure to the 7 seals that we have in the book of Revelation. We have the white horse with a bow and a crown that parallels Mark 13:7. The fiery red horse, sword and slaughter, Mark 13:8. The black horse of the famine, where Jesus predicts famine, Mark 13:8. The pale horse of death, Mark 13:8. And then in Mark 13:9 and following, we see that the question of when is this going to take place or how long, you see, and that's what the martyrs ask, how long? Then there's the earthquake, and the sky is ripped apart in the 7th seal, which parallels Mark 13:24 and following. So you see that the vision of the apocalypse in Revelation is an outflow of the Jesus apocalypse, which itself is an outflow of an ancient prophetic tradition in Israel. So these multiple fulfillments can be described as like telescoping, where you had the original day of the Lord, and then they are fulfilled in these cosmic historic events that each one has an epoch turning change that accompanies them. And each one intensifies until its final eschatological fulfillment in the end. So each is a picture of the day of the Lord as it telescopes and broadens to the final end. Each is a picture of the end. I hope that this is helpful to you as you consider Luke's Olivet Discourse. God bless.